So I wonder, Batya, if you have interrogated that question at all. What do you think at bottom was the problem with Whoopi Goldberg's with statements on The View?
So, like a lot of Jews I know, my feelings and thoughts about it have evolved in the week since it happened. At first it was very shocking and horrifying, but then, of course, talking to Black friends and talking to other Jewish friends. Okay, so I've arrived at what I think is, my current understanding of her comments, which obviously I reserve the right to change as somebody who thinks it's really important to change your mind when you're wrong. So I think that this is how I would summarize it right now. I think she made 3 mistakes and got at 2 potentially very true things. So the mistakes I think she made are what you mentioned already. The Holocaust, of course, was about race. Hitler thought Jews were, an inferior race, right? Just historically completely wrong. Of course, you can have bigotry against minorities who are not Black. That also seemed to be precluded by what she was saying. So I'd say that was the second mistake. She seemed to be making that kind of, I'm sorry, forgive me, but like that woke, analysis where, oppression and skin color are correlated. And that is the definition of, oppression, victimization, and people who have lighter skin cannot be racially oppressed or ethnically oppressed, which is not true. And the third thing I would say is, Jews are not white. So, Jewishness is not a race. Most Jews do not consider themselves to be a race because, as I'm sure you guys agree, race is a social construct. Jewishness is difficult to define because Jews predate the modern categories we have for thinking about these things, so it's sort of the definition of Judaism sits uncomfortably at the intersection of an ethnicity and a history and a religion and a culture and a language and, a set of texts, right? It's a difficult thing to define, but most Jews would not call themselves white. They might call themselves white passing if they have white skin like me. I sometimes say that, but the reduction of Jews into whiteness is something that many Jews find extremely offensive. Now, what I want to say, and now I want to get to the 2 things I think that she very clumsily perhaps was gesturing at that I think are really important to bring up and difficult to bring up. So the first is anti-Black racism is different. And it's worse in America. The history is worse. The current way in which we are still failing descendants of slaves is worse than what any other ethnic minority suffers in America, certainly Jews. I mean, American Jews in this generation, we are the luckiest Jews to ever walk planet Earth. It's ridiculous to compare what Jews go through today, even as anti-Semitism is on the rise, with forms of anti-Black racism that are still state-sponsored. So that's the first thing that I think she was clumsily gesturing at, which is what they do to us is different, like at some qualitative level. And I think that I agree with her on that, even though I think she did not say it very well. And the second point, which I think is probably even more controversial, is this, and then I'm going to cede the floor back to you guys. I think that there is a kind of a stolen valor happening when you have these groups that represent different minorities, Jews, immigrants, Muslims, Asians, Latinos, all sort of trying to get on this, intersectional train and say, look, fighting oppression for everybody is intertwined. And I just think that that's ridiculous. Because again, like what we did and what we continue to do to the American descendants of slaves is qualitatively different. It is qualitatively worse. And to the extent that she was trying to point that out, that there is this kind of, you keep asking the Black community to lend its voice to these other things that are bad. They're bad. Anti-Semitism's bad. But come on, like where are our priorities, right? When we're thinking of levels of, oppression that still remains. So I think that those are the 2 things that, clumsily she was gesturing at that I do think are important to talk about.
So, I mean, there's a lot there and I want to circle back to some of it, but I want to get your read on one of the first things, I want to get your read, Thomas, on one of the first things that Batya said, which was this idea that Jews aren't white and don't have a self-perception of white as being white. And I was with you so much, Batya, through a lot of that, but it does seem to me in an American context, in particular, I mean, that's the only context I can really speak to. I don't think that people are looking at, high profile folks. Jared Kushner, for some reason, is the first name that pops into my head. Barbara Streisand, whomever, and thinking that person isn't white. I mean, Thomas, you make so much, you talk and write so much about these questions. When you think about race in America, are you encountering a conception of Jewish people that is non-white? Or is it white and an ethnic identifier on top of it, the same way you have like white Latinos, let's say?
Well, no, it's different than white Latinos. I mean, this idea of monolithic whiteness is newish. It's not so old. It's not so old that there are not people living who can remember a time when their grandparents could tell them that Irish and Italians were not participating in what we now think of as like seamless kind of monolithic whiteness.
Certainly historically.
Jews were also in,
and I would say
20th century.
Sure, but I would say also, there's literature, the book famous, Becoming White or whatever it is, where Jews, Italians, a lot of different people were considered not white. But today, I mean, what is your
Today, there's a concept of monolithic whiteness that is new. It's kind of strange. I have a lot of problems with it because I think it flattens and erases enormous ethnic and cultural and historical differences. I actually did a podcast a long time ago with Mark Oppenheimer and Alana Newhouse at Tablet. I was asking them if they consider themselves white, and they both rejected that they were white. And that was something that I would encourage more Jews and other kind of ethnicized white people to do more in speech and language, is to assert a kind of difference that subverts this monolithic identity. I also was really, and this is maybe getting on a tangent, but I really liked what ADOS was doing when they were saying, we want to not have monolithic blackness, and we want to say that there are ethnic differences with real historical trajectories, and so that a Jamaican is not the same as a 13th generation sharecropper from Louisiana or Mississippi. I think that these distinctions matter. I think that race itself is a mistake. Coming out of plantation logic and domination for economic purposes. And so that all of these things should make us pause and think, why are these words so fuzzy? Why do they mean so many different things to different people? And what would it do to us if we had much more sophisticated and specific ways of talking about ourselves that didn't fall into the kind of easy rhetoric of, well, the Holocaust was white on white violence. I think we need a much better conversation than that. So Whoopi definitely erred, but she did stumble into something that was poignant. And I think that's why we're still talking about it now.
Well, Thomas, what do you think that she was getting at? Because I went back and watched, the full segment. And I think most of what gets played over and over again is the clip where it basically starts, Jews are white, or whatever it is, that really declarative statement.
Well, also, if you're going to do this, then let's be truthful about it, because the Holocaust isn't about race. No, it's not about race.
Ethnicity.
Well, they
No,
consider
it's
Jews
about
a different race.
But it's not about race. It's not about race.
What is it about?
Because it's about man's inhumanity to man. That's what it's about.
But it's about white supremacy. It's
Well,
about
but
going
it's not-
after
it's
Jews
not about
and
ideal race.
gypsies
It's-
and
but these are two
Romas.
white groups of people.
Well, they go after black
They
people
just see
too.
them as white
And they
people.
go
But you're
after
missing the
homosexuals.
point. You're missing the point. The
Yeah.
minute you turn it into race, it goes down this alley. Let's talk about it for what it is. It's how people treat each other. It's a problem. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, because black, white, Jews, everybody eats each other. So if you're uncomfortable, if you hear about mouse, should you be worried? Should your child say, oh my God, I wonder if that's me? No, that's not what they're gonna say. They're gonna say, I don't wanna be like that.
But I noticed that earlier in the segment, she made an allusion to, she said something along the lines of, these are white people doing it to each other. These are white people doing it to themselves.
I'm not sure that they don't use the naked part as a kind of a canard to throw you off from the fact that they don't
Maybe.
like history that makes white people look bad.
Well, this is white people doing it to white people.
Yeah.
So this is, y'all go fight amongst yourselves, but don't.
And it felt to me like she was trying to make a different kind of point. And it felt to me like she was trying to separate out a racial conversation, perhaps because she knows how much, particularly racialized kind of white-black conversations in the States are politicized and marginalized because they are a particularly racialized conversation. It almost felt like she wanted to take it away from a space where we could say, oh, here go Black people complaining again. Here go minorities complaining again. And almost wanted to elevate it to this like philosophical Platonic ideal of human conflict in a way that ultimately ended up erasing the very particularized kind of harm that was done. Did you pick up on that? Am I being overly?
Yeah, I don't
kind
think
to
that what
Whoopi?
she said was so crazy or upsetting or very different than what many people can say in America. And like Batya said, she's participating in a very American parochialism that kind of some of our most celebrated race writers also participate in, when they just forget all of these distinctions that exist outside of the American dynamic. I mean, the idea that Jews in the mid 20th century, early 20th century were white the same as Aryans, I mean, or so-called Aryans, it's preposterous, but it's a view you encounter all the time in America, that, racial differences between Black and white, it erases the kind of granular differences in ethnicity that exists throughout the Black world. I mean, it's just a very, very oversimplified way of thinking about differences among people. So, I mean, she made a mistake. I think a lot of the smartest writing I've seen on this, Jamel Bowie had a smart piece in the Times, basically says, it wasn't the most trenchant commentary you're going to get on race, but it really wasn't actually malicious, and she wasn't, speaking in an anti-Semitic way. So her comments didn't really bother me. I was kind of surprised that it was made into the scandal that it was made into, and I think it's absurd that she had to be performatively punished for it.
Well, what do you think about that, Batya? Because, I mean, you write about kind of woke overreach and kind of liberal, lefty cancel culture issues. Do you think that Whoopi's 2-week suspension and the kind of media fracas that has emerged over this are an example of exactly that kind of woke overreach?
Yeah, but what's even funnier is that Fox News thinks so too, right? So what happened after Whoopi was suspended was she was defended by a lot of liberals who were like, oh, maybe this has gone too far now that it came from one of theirs. But then she was also defended by all the hosts on Fox News who were like, she apologized. What the heck? And I totally agree with that. She apologized immediately, very sincerely. It was clear, on Colbert, that she didn't really get what the big deal was, but she said sorry. I mean, that's all people want. And I don't know any Jews who thought she should have been suspended. I don't know anybody who thought that was appropriate. And it's totally some sort of weird need to have some sort of public reckoning. And most Jewish people, I don't want to say that. There's definitely a debate about it in the Jewish community.
Yeah, I was going to say, Batya, I've seen a lot of people, obviously the Anti-Defamation League came out and made a statement. A lot of people, this pushback, the drive to censure.
Well, but the ADL was on
nowhere.
But the ADL was sort of the exculpatory mechanism, right? He went on the show the next day, the head of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, and so that was sort of him saying no, she shouldn't be. Look, this is the apology that we need. We need to clarify why this was wrong, moving right along. So I felt what I was going to say is to me, it's really important that people like me who think that, who are worried about woke overreach, not have a woke standard for anti-Semitism, like I said before, we're the luckiest Jews to ever walk planet Earth. My parents and my grandparents, they could not have dreamed that Jews would feel this safe in this country, even at a time when anti-Semitism is rising, attacks on Jews are rising. But I think it's so important that we not enforce this, oh my God, don't offend the Jews, that we not do the thing that we criticize about others, where you sort of, you collapse the gap between real anti-Semitism and something that is at worst a microaggression, what Whoopi did.
So I can't get off of this question of what the word race is doing here. Because in my view, it's easy to separate kind of chronologically. At one point in time, Jews, along with a lot of other groups that are now considered to be white in a contemporary context, were perceived not to be white, to be very differently raced and treated and persecuted accordingly. In a contemporary context, even though persecution of some of those groups continues, they are not racialized in the way that they have been done in the past. I feel like you can make that kind of a statement in a way that doesn't that doesn't ignore the specific racialized harms of the past, that acknowledges shifting understandings in the present, and we can keep on keeping on. But I have noticed a real commitment in the discourse around this issue. And Batya, I've heard you say this even in the course of this conversation, that there is still a perception and what feels like almost an investment in continuing to understand Jews as a racialized group. Whereas in my conversation with you, Thomas, it was a lot about stepping away from an investment in an idea of Black people and other groups as specifically racialized. And I wonder what either of you make of what I perceive as a tension there.
So I'll just jump in, but I am very curious what you think about this, Thomas. So most Jews don't think of themselves as a race, but as an ethnicity because it's passed down from parent. So it's, it's in your something, it's not racial because there are Black Jews and there are Asian Jews and there are Latino Jews. There are Jews of all races, to the extent that race is real. But, Jews come in all colors, but it is something that is historically understood as something you pass down to your children. And I think that is, it's just something that is pretty core to the definition, the manifold definitions of what it means to be a Jew. You can join Jews. So it's not only an ethnicity because you can convert right through the religion, but it's most Jews, I think, are attached to the idea that there is an ethnic component that unites them to other Jews. And Thomas, I'm curious if you think that's bad. Yeah. Is that what you were going to ask, Brie?
No, I think cultural connections and ethnic senses of oneself and community make perfect sense. I'm pretty simple in how I see this. It was a mistake to racialize Jews and have the Nuremberg laws and measure out how much Jewish blood makes you deserve whatever trajectory you find yourself on in this society. It was a mistake to racialize a so-called Aryan group as a kind of pure white. It was a mistake to idealize Scandinavian physical characteristics and think that comprises a race. It was a mistake in the 20th century to think that Mediterraneans comprised a kind of inferior white race and Anglo-Saxons a superior one. It was a mistake to racialize Blacks as belonging to a distinct race, inferior in the human family. I mean, these are all enormous mistakes. We know they're mistakes, and what bothered me, I guess, about this conversation is we're debating whether Jews constitute a separate race or not. And the conversation should be much bigger than that. There are no distinct races of the species Homo sapien. And that's where we should be having this debate. And it cannot get there in the mainstream media. And it's extraordinarily frustrating.
But this is why we're having the debate a little bit. Because, Batya, I watched you on The Hill earlier this week, or maybe it was the end of last week. You said that anti-Semitism is racism. Racism specifically, not kind of a prejudice or an ethnic, an anti-ethnic attack, but racism. And that's why I'm hanging on this word race. There is a world where that I think even Whoopi would readily accept, where the persecution is against an ethnicity, against a religious group that has these kind of like hereditary passing down kind of elements to it and all of that. But the way the word race is being used feels very purposeful to me. Batya, you on The Hill, you read the ADL's definition of racism and argued that it was, writing out anti-white racism, and argued that you can be racist against white people too. And that seems to be a little bit in tension with this definition of racism that most people adopt today, that acknowledges that there's a power element to the racism. And I would agree with the critique of some folks in the broad liberal sphere who say that because of that power dynamic, marginalized groups cannot be racist. I don't agree with that because I think there can be different power differentials between marginalized groups, of course. But the idea of anti-white racism, and particularly anti-Jewish prejudice, 100%, even in some factions, anti-Italian prejudice and things like that. I don't know. I am binge watching The Sopranos right now. It's opened my eyes to some things. But anti-white racism, it's not Italians being hated because they're white or Jews being hated because they're white. It's because of these other attributes, whether it's ethnicity, religion, culture, history, all these other things that come into play. So can you unpack that for me a little bit, Batya? What to you is the word race doing in particular? Do you feel like you do have a commitment to the idea of Jewish people as a race and that anti-Semitism is a kind of racism.
I don't believe Jews are a race because I think there are Jews of all races, and I don't think race is real. So I'm with Thomas on this. Like, I think race is not real. But in a context in which the only kind of prejudice that Americans can take seriously is racism. And even in England, I'll give you another example. So in England, when the British Jewish community understood that they were facing this big threat from Jeremy Corbyn, the decision they made was to stop using the word anti-Semitism and start using the word racism, because people didn't understand what anti-Semitism was, but people understand what racism is. And the way in which people who hate Jews for being Jews hate them is the same way that people who hate any other race for their race hate them. So, like, for example, let's say, a young Black man attacks a white person, right? And says, I'm doing this because you're white. Like, we can all accept that race is a social construct and whiteness is not real, but also admit that he is doing this out of a racist belief. And I think the idea that, when you look at these attacks against Asians from young Black men, or Hasidic Jews in Brooklyn from young Latino and Black men, which were 3/4 of 100 attacks on them in between 2019 and 2020, it's very clear that socially, from some sort of like socioeconomic point of view, like, it's clear who has more power in that situation. But when somebody is attacking you, it doesn't matter if they're from a more marginalized community. It doesn't matter that, like, they are overrepresented in the criminal justice system in a way that is racist. It matters that in that moment, they are committing an act because of what they believe to be something different about you. And I just think that this, I don't think it's a race, but I don't think there's a contradiction in anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish racism. That could be totally consistent with the fact that being Jewish is not a race, because if you truly are committed to the view that the left holds, by the way, that race is a social construct, right? Then people who are committing anti-Black racism are also doing it from a racist point of view that is inconsistent with reality, right? But that doesn't mean that they're not being racist when they do it, right? Because people like the Nazis can misunderstand what is true about the world because they're racist. So I think that's how I would explain that.
Yeah, I guess
not convincing.
No, I'm still, because I'm not. What I'm quibbling with isn't the
what's
idea,
the point, right? What's the point of perpetuating
race as a social construct or anything like that? Yeah. My point is that there does seem to be, because you spoke earlier about the fact that there are different lived realities of people who are perceived, regardless if we want to subscribe to it, perceived to be members of various racial or ethnic groups in this country. And that all are not evenly yoked or evenly marginalized, shall we say. At the same time, there does seem to me to be something in the project of redefining race in a way that treats whiteness as, doesn't acknowledge the particular position that white people in America have, regardless of, kind of separate and apart from any ethnic identity, that seems to collapse that exact kind of different racial hierarchies that you said earlier that were so important to acknowledge.
So let me, I want to respond to that, and then I'm so curious what Thomas thinks about all this. I don't think America is a white supremacy, because I think there are a lot of non-white groups that are doing great that America has been very good to. I think America has a unique problem with anti-Blackness in 4 unique specific areas that I'm happy to talk about. So I think that America has and continues to abandon the descendants of slaves over and over and over again. It has a unique problem with one group, in fact, one subgroup of, the Black community specifically. But I think it's been very good to, there has never been a country that has been as good to my people, and there are a lot of minorities that is true about. So to me, instead of talking about anti-Blackness and instead of talking about the areas in which we are still abandoning the descendants of slaves, we go one step above and start talking about white supremacy and pathologizing whiteness, when that's not the problem at all. It's not everybody who's not white that has a problem. It's one specific non-white group. And
Batya, well, I think that maybe Native Americans would have something to say about that. I think that many Asian immigrant groups that are not the more high achieving, more affluent immigrant groups from China and Japan and Korea might have something to say about that. The poorest neighborhood community income-wise in New York City is in Chinatown. I got to push back a little against this idea that there is only one group in America, one ethnic group, that is suffering the consequences of a tiered racial hierarchy in this country, or a series of laws that have excluded any number of people, including Asian people, from even immigrating to the country until the third decade of the last century.
Right. But today we know that Asian Americans are one of the most socially mobile groups in America. So yes,
if you lump
but that's what we're talking
2
about.
billion people in Asia,
right. No, but we're talking about race, right? So yes, it's true. There are poor Chinese people. That's a problem of class. That's an income problem, right? But
I'm saying if you look at immigrants from Laos or Vietnam, the demographics of Asian immigrants, if you separate them, their country of origin out, are very different than the demographics, the outcomes for immigrants from other parts of Asia. That's what
I feel like that proves my point, but I want to give Thomas a chance to jump in here.
I was debating with myself whether I would say something, but I think it's true. And Albert Murray has already said it. So I want to echo something that Batya said. I do think there's a distinct situation that the descendant of slaves, of American slaves, faces that is unique, that no one else suffers or no one else quite experienced in the American context. But you're right, Bree, that Native Americans also have a unique experience that it gets silly to compare, which is worse. I mean, both groups were treated in very specific ways. With that said, I do want to say, like Batya has said a couple of times, that the Jews living in America are the luckiest Jews ever. I think that, Black Americans are the luckiest African descended people ever, by and large, especially if you're talking about living in the 21st century.
Oh, yes.
I see your smile, but there's not another country that I would roll the dice and take my chances.
So you guys, you're both doing the Steven Pinker thing. So first of all, I would object to the truth of that on its face. But before we even get there, there is a kind of a narrative that's been very popularized by a lot of folks like Steven Pinker and has been adopted by a lot of people on the right, that likes to say, because of the nature of history and technology and progress, everything is better now than it used to be, and therefore we shouldn't have conversations.
We should have conversations.
That idea is kind of wielded as a way to disrupt any kind of conversation about the way that we need to improve our society still on an ongoing way. So to me, even if it were true that Black people have never had it better, which I don't know, I'm reflecting on my family and my life. That's a tough pill to swallow, but the Black people have never had it better in any place in a global history than in America right now. I don't really understand what the utility of that statement is in a conversation about ongoing harms of the severity that we all understand exist.
Oh, well, I just brought it up to say that I think that Batya has a point in that you can extend that to other groups as well. I think that, America is a complicated and contradictory society, but with quite a lot of pain and suffering, but with quite a lot of upsides. And not everybody shares the same monolithic experience within a group. There's a lot of difference within groups, not just between and among groups. So I just wanted to say that that's not really here nor there, maybe, but I think it's actually important to emphasize, and it's something that Albert Murray always, the great essayist and just blues scholar and blues philosopher Albert Murray, that I think, more people should be in touch with his Black perspective as well. That's my plug for that. As for, the rest of what Batya was saying, I'm not sure, can you prompt me with a question? I'm not sure I remember all of the ins and outs.
Well, it's this question of this racism equals prejudice plus power dynamic. Because I think that this is really at the core of both Whoopi's kind of confusion and the broader controversy, and this kind of, back and forth about whether or not Judaism is a race, or Jews are considered to be racialized in a contemporary context. Because what is at stake seems to be whether or not, if you belong to the white power group, the argument is, if you belong to the white group in power, sorry, not the white power group, but the white group that is in power, does that mean you relinquish all claims to prejudice, being victims of prejudice or persecution? I would argue absolutely not. Because the power dynamic means that even if you're a white, there are these other things that can operate, including ethnic identity, et cetera. However, it does seem to me that the push to say explicitly, no, it is a race, we are contemporarily racialized, is about a feeling that, like a misunderstanding about whether or not in that race plus power dynamic, you can still be marginalized even though you are white. And I would prefer, I think, to live in a world where you can be marginalized if you're white, and we talk about class, and we talk about regional disparities, and we talk about the opioid crisis, and we talk about anti-Semitism. We talk about all of those things without needing to ignore the reality of people being able to invisibilize certain aspects of their identity because they are subsumed in a broader cultural understanding of whiteness in America today.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.